Today's lesson will be covering Chapter 10 on development. We've been talking about development a lot throughout the entire curriculum. So this should be a lot of review, but going into a bit more depth. At the core of gauging development, we can look at the United Nations. The UN puts out the HDI every year, and this HDI assesses the affluence of countries around the world. There are three primary ways the United Nations uses the Human Development Index to gauge where a country ranks. A decent standard of living can be reflected in the GNI, or gross national income per capita. The second category is a long and healthy life. This is reflected in the life expectancy. This is how long the average person in a country is expected to live. The third category, which is knowledge, is reflected in education. It is accounted for in two ways. The first, by the average number of years of schooling the average citizen will have in their lifetime, and in the literacy rate. A literacy rate is the ability for someone to be able to read and write. Let's break those down one more time in the most simplest way possible. A country's level of development will be dictated by how strong their education system is, how strong their healthcare system is, and whether or not they can have a decent standard of living based in the income that they're able to make. Take a look at figure 10-1 located on page 350 of your textbook. This map shows the Human Development Index, and this index measures development by country around the world. As you can see in the key, the darkest green will indicate the most developed regions of the world. North America is included, Western Europe is included, parts of Southwest Asia on the Arabian Peninsula are included, Australia and New Zealand are included, Japan and South Korea are included, and Argentina and Chile are included as well. This key will also help us distinguish four distinctive categories of very high developed, high developing, medium developing, and low developing. The United Nations will refer to countries that are developed or developing more so as MDCs or LDCs. MDCs representing more developed countries and LDCs representing less developed countries. As you'll also see, the next high developing category will include Russia and China. The medium developing will include Egypt, India, and the Philippines. And the low developing will include Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sudan, and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's discuss standard of living in HDI. It can be a little misleading because the gross national income can be very high, but if the cost of living is very high, then the income may not necessarily get an individual very far. This is why the PPP may be a better reflection. This is the purchasing power parity. This means based in the income and based in how much everything costs in the country, that will give you a better understanding of what the standards of living would be like reflected in that income. Other measures of standard of living can be reflected in economic structures. In this case, we'll look at primary, secondary, and tertiary. With a primary structure, this means that most people are earning livings through agriculture, maybe mining, fishing, or forestry. These kinds of jobs are far more common in developing countries. The secondary sector has to do with industry. This is where manufacturing takes place, bringing raw materials and manufacturing them into consumer goods. As developing countries start to transition and become more developed, a larger share of their jobs will be in the secondary sector. The tertiary sector involves services rather than goods, and these services are provided in exchange for payment. This includes retailing, banking, law, education, and government. In more developed countries, or the most developed countries, you are going to see a larger share of the jobs held by citizens in the tertiary sector. This brings us to the concept of productivity. In the most developed countries, you will find that workers are more productive. When we mean more productive, it doesn't mean that they're working harder, longer hours, more labor-intensive work. We're talking about the amount of money that is paid for their labor. Take a look at figure 10-4, looking at income. This map is going to show gross national income per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity. As you can see, purchasing power is a lot higher in your more developed countries, and it's much lower in your less developed countries. Figure 10-6, located on page 353 of your textbook, will show GDP PPP per hour. And this is going to be a reflection of productivity. Again, productivity is not on how many hours an individual works, how labor intensive it is, how hard they work, but rather how much money is paid for that labor. So in the key here, you see the amount of money per hour, for example. And it's much higher in your more developed countries and much lower in your less developed countries. Many countries do not have data to show. Looking at education, we can look at a series of maps. Let's look at the average years of schooling. As you can see, the darker green will be the areas that have higher number of years required for students to take, and the lighter colors are going to indicate less years. And so again, this coincides with our understanding of our more developed countries versus our less developed countries. Another place to look into education would be pupil per teacher ratio. So this is the number of students to teachers. It is a lot lower in your more developed countries and higher in your less developed countries. This means that there are far more teachers in the more developed countries and far less teachers in the less developed countries. This map will give you a stronger sense of what regions of the world have greater access to education. Literacy rates are another measure of access to knowledge. In this map, figure 10-10, located on page 355 of your textbook, is going to show the darkest purple in the areas with the highest literacy rates, again coinciding with your more developed countries compared to your less developed countries. Now we can get into life expectancy. Looking at life expectancy, we can see a comparison of many different countries on this graph. We can look at the lowest life expectancies, which are more common in the region of sub-Saharan Africa, and we can see at the highest represented in Japan and South Korea. Again, higher life expectancies can help us gauge how strong a healthcare system is. Another way we can gauge development is through access to consumer goods. In this case, we're talking about motor vehicles or automobiles. And so we can see how many automobiles there are in a country per 1,000 persons. We see that through the key, this is much higher, again, in your more developed countries and far lower in your less developed countries. Other examples of consumer goods that can give us a reflection of how developed a country or region may be would include internet access or cell phone usage. One very important thing to consider with the HDI is it's not the best reflection of what most people in a country might be experiencing. This is why the United Nations also puts out a second set of data, known as the HDI adjusted for inequality. This is made most evident when we look at income. With income, we know that a country like the United States, for example, with a very high concentration of wealth in very few hands, can sway and skew the average level of income that it may look like the average person enjoys, when in fact most people make far less. Looking at the key, when looking at HDI adjusted for inequality, The closer a country is to 1, meaning there's no inequality, then the less inequality there is. The further away from 1 it gets, the more inequality there is. Notice what countries remain at the top in green, and notice which countries start to slip. The United States becomes the most obvious. It is not as comparable to the more developed countries when looking at the level of inequality. We can also see that inequality can exist between regions as well. We talked about this in political geography. Take a look at figure 10-16. Turkey's wealthiest regions happen to be in the west, and the eastern area is much poorer on average. Much of the reason that you see regional disparities or inequities can be for multiple reasons. Perhaps the wealthier area is much more invested in by the government, whereas other areas are not. Maybe the more urban areas are far more developed, but the rural areas are not. This can also be impacted by different ethnic, racial, or religious groups, where one group is dominant and the other group is suppressed or oppressed. In Turkey, we see that the Kurdish region is experiencing this, and you learned about the Kurds in your political geography unit. This map in particular shows the per capita GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product. It's a reflection of all goods and services in a country and the value of those goods and services. So when divided per person, the greener areas are far wealthier, as you see, than the much lighter areas. Figure 10-17 also shows this, looking at Brazil's wealth being concentrated in the south and the east along the coast, but much less as you move inward. Figure 10-18 demonstrates the share of wealth held by the richest 1% has increased in the United States and the United Kingdom since about 1980. This is a trend that we actually see throughout the world. The last topic we're going to cover has to do with gender inequality, and we've talked about this quite a bit in class. The more equality there is between genders, the more developed a country is going to be. Gender inequality can be gauged through 2 different ways, through the Gender-Related Development Index and through the Gender Inequality Index. For the GDI, the closer to 1, the more equality there is. For the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII, the closer to 1, the more inequality. The 3 most important, most vital categories that can help us gauge how women are treated in a country is through reproductive health, female empowerment, and the female labor force participation. As you can see in figure 10-19, and the Gender-Related Development Index, the more developed countries are in the darker green. Your less developed countries are going to be in yellow. 10-20 will show you the Gender Inequality Index. Again, as you see here, the darker purple, the furthest away from 1 are your countries in your more developed regions, and the closer to 1 are your countries in the less developed regions. Increased gender equality is a trend in most countries around the world, and this is something that is a major goal of the United Nations. How do you measure female empowerment? Look at the percentage of seats held by women in a country's national legislative body. You may be surprised to see that looking at the more developed regions of the world, the US falls short in this category. The US comes back up in female empowerment when it comes to ratio of girls to boys in secondary schools. We can also see trends that are similar when it comes to the number of females that are in the labor force. There is a bit of inconsistency because there are more women in tertiary sectors of developed countries and more women in primary sectors of less developed countries.